Okay, good evening, everyone, and thank you all for joining us tonight. Before we get started, I would like to thank the Friends of the Library for helping to make tonight's program possible. Without their support, much of the programs that we hold would not be possible. I also want to let you know about a couple of upcoming programs. We are going to be starting in-person programming again beginning this Sunday, October 3rd at 3 p.m. with a jazz concert being performed by the Alex Minasian Trio. And this program is going to be held in the Richardson building, so the old part of the library. We're also going to begin hosting a series of programs as part of our Homesteading Basics series. This will begin on Monday, October 4th at 7 p.m., so that's 1 week from tonight, with our program on cultivating mushrooms. This program is going to be held in our meeting room. I would like you to note that with all of our programs going forward, that there will be capacity limits for our events. Masks are also recommended, but not required, and doors will open 15 minutes before the start of the program. And now I would like to introduce our speaker for tonight, local author and writer, David Crew. David, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us, whether you're on the Zoom or somehow being live streamed or YouTube. This is exciting to be on so many platforms tonight. So what I'm going to first do is I'm going to stop my video and continue chatting and tell you that tonight we're going to be talking. First of all, this is one of my favorite shows, Law and Order. And what we're going to be doing tonight is kind of going through the sequence they do on Law and Order. We're going to look at the crime, which in this case are 3 murder cases that took place in 3 different centuries. All of them were groundbreaking in some way. And what we're going to be doing tonight is talking about them in this order. We're going to be starting with the Boston Massacre, one of the most prominent and controversial cases in Boston legal history. Then we'll look at the Dr. Parkman murder from the 19th century, and we'll finish up talking about a case that maybe some of you might be personally familiar with, the Boston Strangler case of the 1960s. So let's start with the Boston Massacre, a seminal event, not just in Boston history, but in American history as well. Now, we all know the basic facts that on March 5th, 1770, 5 citizens were killed when British troops opened fire on a crowd outside the old State House here in Boston. So just like Lenny Briscoe and Ed Green, our job will be to ferret out the details of the case so it can be handed over, not to Sam Waterston, but in this case, John Adams. So let's set the scene. These were very tense times. The British had started imposing taxes on the colonists to pay for the French and Indian War, but I mean, why shouldn't they? The crown was protecting them and supporting them with one of the world's great navies. So in 1767, the British Parliament passed the Townshend Acts, which taxed paper, glass, and tea. And the colonists started rebelling. I mean, nobody likes paying taxes. So in late 1768, Boston regulars arrived in Boston to maintain order. Bostonians responded by taunting them with name-calling, spitting, and fighting. Now, in early 1770, a merchant announced publicly that he would ignore a town-wide boycott against British goods, and some colonists hung him in effigy outside his shop. On February 22nd, a loyalist named Ebenezer Richardson attempted to destroy the effigy, and a mob drove him to his house, from where he fired several shots, one of which killed an 11-year-old boy named Christopher Snyder. 6 days later, there was an immense funeral parade from the Liberty Tree on Essex Street today down to the cemetery. Posters were distributed throughout the town implying the boy's death must be avenged. 4 days after the funeral, a British soldier named Thomas Walker entered John Gray's rope walk in Dock Square looking for work. And this was common. Army pay was pretty bad, and soldiers were always looking for extra work. So the rope maker asked Walker, "Soldier, do you want work?" "Well, yes, I do," Walker replied. And then Green said something classy like, "Well, then go and clean my outhouse." only he didn't say outhouse. And so a fist fight began, made worse when Walker leaves and returns with some of his soldiers, his older friends. Now there's a full-scale brawl going on with fists, clubs, and swords. And the next day, March 3rd, 3 soldiers returned to the rope walk to fight some more, and one got a fractured skull for his trouble. Early on the evening of March 5th, on King Street, a young wig maker's apprentice named Garrick sees a British officer named Captain Goldfinch. Garrick turns to another soldier, a private white, who was on guard in front of the custom house, and he said, "Oh, look, there goes the fellow that will not pay my master for dressing his hair." Now, Goldfinch had in fact settled his account and ignored the insult, but in this climate, these tense times, there's no way the matter was going to be dropped, and Garrick, joined by his friends, continued his verbal assault of Goldfinch. Private White says that Goldfinch was, quote, an officer and a gentleman who always paid his debts. And Garrick replied, "There are no gentlemen in the 29th Regiment." So White turns to Garrick and says, "Let me see your face." And so Garrick thrusts out his jaw, at which point White smashes his musket into Garrick's face, and he falls to the ground bleeding. "Bloody lobster back, lousy rascal, lobster son of a bitch." People in the crowd are yelling. Somebody started ringing the town bells, signaling the alarm of fire. Now, "There is no fire," someone else yelled. "Well, kill him, knock him down. Fire, damn you. You dare not fire." All of these things are being yelled, and some people began to throw snowballs and pieces of ice at White, who loads his gun and then wisely starts to retreat to the custom house stairs with his back to a locked door. That's when he yells, "Turn out the guard, main guard, turn out." Now, in front of the main guard, the officer for the day, Captain Thomas Preston, he didn't know what to do. If he did nothing, he thought White could be killed by the mob. But he knew his soldiers would be vastly outnumbered by the mob if he tried to rescue him. Moreover, Preston knew that province law forbid the military from firing on civilians without the order of a magistrate. Outside, another 200 people were gathering in Dock Square. The whole town seemed to be on edge. People were yelling fire, even though no buildings were burning that night. Soldiers passed up and down Brattle Street, shown here, carrying clubs, bayonets, and other weapons. In Boylston's Alley, a battle ensued between the regulars and townspeople until a passing officer led the troops to the nearby Murray's Barracks. That's what this church is, the Brattle Street Church, which you can see here. Meanwhile, finally, Captain Preston made the decision to rescue Private White. "Turn out, damn your bloods, turn out," he barked at his men. They meet up with Private White at the custom house stairs and load their muskets as the crowd, now figured to be somewhere between 300 to 400 people, formed a semicircle. And they're throwing chunks of coal and snowballs and oyster shells and sticks at the soldiers. And Preston is shouting at them to please disperse. And just then, 47-year-old Crispus Attucks, wielding a club, moved forward and grabbed one of the soldiers' bayonets and knocked him to the ground. The soldier rose, shouting, quote, "Damn you, fire!" and fired one shot in the direction of the crowd. Now, nobody seems to have been hit by that first shot, and the crowd pulled away from the troops. And then there was a pause. Now, some people said it was little as 6 seconds. Some others testified as much as 2 minutes. We simply don't know. What we do know is the troops started firing. Samuel Gray fell with a hole in his head. Crispus Attucks took 2 bullets in the chest. As some members of the crowd surged forward, another sailor, James Caldwell, was hit. A ricocheting bullet struck 17-year-old Samuel Maverick as he ran toward the townhouse. And Patrick Carr's back was ripped apart by another shot. It was sheer mayhem. Captain Preston yelled at his men, demanding to know why they had fired. Well, some said they thought they had heard the word fire, but as I said, a lot of people were yelling it that night. Some in the crowd moved to help those who were hit, and the troops raised their muskets. Preston commanded them to cease fire, and he went down the line, pushing up their musket barrels. The wounded, the dying, and the dead were carried away. Captain Preston and his men then marched back to the main guard. Now, word of the shootings reached acting Governor Thomas Hutchinson, and he rushed to King Street, where he found the angry mob and a shaken Captain Preston. The governor confronts Preston and says, "Do you know, sir, you have no power to fire on anybody of the public collected together, except you have a civil magistrate with you to give orders?" Well, after talking with Preston, Hutchinson proceeded upstairs into the townhouse. After assuring the town council, which was inside, that he would do his best to see justice done, he stepped onto the balcony overlooking the scene of the massacre, where a crowd was still milling about. And he said these famous words, "Let the law have its course. I will live and die by the law." Shortly thereafter, Justices Richard Dania and John Tudor issued a warrant for the arrest of Captain Preston, who was brought to the townhouse where he was interrogated by the justices. They concluded they had, quote, "evidence sufficient to commit him," and they sent Preston to jail, where he would remain for the next 7 months. The next day, this 34-year-old man, John Adams, was asked to defend the soldiers and their captain. Now, Adams understood that taking the case would not only subject him to criticism, but might jeopardize his legal practice, which he was just starting out with, or even risk the safety of himself and his family. But he believed deeply that every person deserved a defense, and he took on the case. For his efforts, he would receive the modest sum of 18 guineas. A week after the massacre, at the request of the Attorney General, Jonathan Sewall, a grand jury handed down indictments against Captain Preston and the 8 soldiers. About the same time, Preston would offer his version of the events in a deposition. Now, some big decisions had to be made by the court, the prosecution, and by Adams. Should Captain Preston be tried separately from his men? Now, some of the 8 soldiers under his command wanted to be tried with their captain, and for good reason, because Preston's best defense lay in denying that he gave any orders to fire. And the soldiers' best defense lay in claiming that they were simply following their captain's orders. Now, I'm not a lawyer, and as a layperson, I find this a fascinating case for this reason alone. Is following orders a defense? The decisions rendered here would resonate throughout history at Nuremberg, My Lai, Serbia, and even Guantanamo. Another big question was the order of the cases, because if Preston's trial were to go first, the soldiers' defense might be compromised. Finally, we have the fact that John Adams would defend both Preston and his men, even though their respective defenses were at odds with one another. My understanding is that today that would constitute an ethical dilemma which would have forced Adams to choose between his clients. Meanwhile, the soldiers' bid for a joint trial was denied anyway, and done so without explanation. So Captain Preston's trial for murder would come first, from October 24th to the 30th, here at the Queen Street Courthouse. And this case was a classic political hot potato. The Chief Justice of the Superior Court, Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson, he declined to preside at the trials. Benjamin Lind of Salem became the acting Chief Justice, and he tried twice to resign his position before the trials began. Attorney General Sewall actually refused to prosecute the soldiers. The prosecution was led by Samuel Quincy, the colony's first Solicitor General, and Robert Treat Paine, who later became the first Attorney General of the state and a Justice of the state Supreme Court. Josiah Quincy would assist John Adams in his defense of Preston. The central issue concerned whether or not Preston had given the order to fire on the civilians. Now, he steadfastly denied that he did, and he was supported by 3 defense witnesses. But 4 witnesses for the prosecution swore that he did. As an example, eyewitness Daniel Califf testified, quote, "I heard one of the guns rattle. I turned about and looked and heard the officer who stood on the right in a line with the soldiers give the word fire twice. I looked at the officer in the face when he gave the word and saw his mouth. I saw his face plain. The moon shone on it." Now, there is no transcript of this trial, nothing survived, but Preston likely defended himself as he did in his deposition, which we do have copies of, when he vigorously denied giving any orders to shoot. John Adams evidently succeeded in creating doubts in the minds of jurors as to whether Preston ever gave the order to fire. The sequestered 12-man jury deliberated only a few hours before acquitting Preston on all charges. 8 weeks later, on November 27th, the 8 soldiers faced trial. There is a transcript of that trial, formerly called Rex v. Weems et al., and it survived. Witnesses testified to the clashes with the military at Gray's Rope Walk, which I've described, as well as to other events on the night of March 5th near King Street. On December 5th, 1770, exactly 9 months after the massacre, 6 of the soldiers were acquitted on all charges. 2, Montgomery and Kilroy, were convicted of manslaughter because it was ruled there was proof that they fired into the crowd. At their sentencing on December 14th, they pleaded the benefit of clergy to reduce their punishments to branding, and the court accepted their plea, and their right thumbs were branded before the 2 men were sent back to England. Later that month, Captain Preston would sail for England, but not before receiving 200 pounds in compensation for his troubles relating to the massacre and the trial. Now, how the 5 victims of the massacre were viewed depended on where you stood, of course. Loyalists saw them as thugs and ruffians, but patriots made them into martyrs for the cause of American independence, not just here in Boston, but throughout the British colonies. And the case catapulted John Adams into the public eye, and he would later serve as our 2nd president. Of the 3 cases we are talking about tonight, only this one has a single victim. But of all the victims in our 3 cases, Dr. George Parkman is the only one who was prominent before his death. Oliver Wendell Holmes once called George Parkman, quote, the perfect Yankee. He said that Parkman, quote, abstained while others indulged, walked while others rode, worked while others slept. Parkman grew up the son of a successful businessman who owned property in the West End of Boston. But when he grew up, instead of taking up the family business, he studied medicine and graduated from Harvard Medical College in 1813. He then traveled to Europe, where he became interested in the plight of the insane. This would turn out to be an ironic choice. And here's a cool fact about Parkman I learned. He returned to America from Europe on board the USS Constitution. Back in Boston in 1813, with the War of 1812 still on, Parkman enlisted and received a commission as surgeon in the Massachusetts militia. At the same time, he was also a physician to the poor. His experience in Europe taught Parkman that psychiatric institutions should reflect a residence-like setting, where patients could enjoy hobbies and socializing and participating in household chores. So in 1817, he convinced the trustees of the Massachusetts General Hospital that he could supervise an asylum they were considering opening. And that same year, he offered to raise $16,000 for construction. Now, Parkman thought he was a cinch to be named head of what would be called the McLean's Hospital. But the trustees gave the position to someone else because they were concerned how it would look if Parkman was given an appointment that he himself had endowed. Parkman apparently took some sort of a hissy fit because while he didn't give up medicine, he shifted his focus back to the family business, of which he took complete control after his father passed. And by 1849, he was worth some $500,000. A lot of money back then. This is John White Webster, who was born in Boston in 1793 and was, like Parkman, another rich and well-connected Bostonian. He also studied at Harvard Medical College, and he practiced in the Azores before returning to America. In 1824, he began working for Harvard, eventually becoming a professor in 1827. He was married and had 4 daughters. Unlike Parkman, though, Webster always seemed to be having money troubles. He had lost the mansion he built in Cambridge due to mounting debt and had been borrowing money from many people, including his friend, George Parkman, from whom he first borrowed $400 in 1842. Now, 5 years later, he still hadn't repaid that loan. So he gave Parkman a note for $2,432, not only to cover the unpaid balance, but to borrow even more money. Now, for collateral, he used in part a cabinet of minerals that he owned. Now, a year later, in 1848, he borrows another $1,200 from a guy named Robert Gould Shaw. Yeah, the father of that Robert Gould Shaw. I'm telling you, these guys all hung out with Boston's elite. But here's the thing. As collateral for the Gould Shaw loan, he used the same mineral collection that he had already used for the Parkman loan. George Parkman heard about this and was furious, and he began to hound Webster for his money. On November 23rd, 1849, a week before Thanksgiving, George Parkman left his Beacon Hill mansion to do some errands. He was last seen walking towards the Harvard Medical College to meet his friend, Dr. Webster. And then George Parkman disappeared off the face of the earth. Now, a prominent man like Parkman doesn't just disappear. People notice, and they notice quickly. And within 2 days, the family had 28,000 copies of this $3,000 reward notice printed up, posted, and distributed all around town. And rumors were flying around the city. An Irish immigrant had done the deed. Why not? Let's blame the Irish. Or one of Parkman's deadbeat tenants. Or maybe it was a robbery gone awry. Folks, there were over 100 newspapers in the city at the time, and this story was helping to sell a lot of papers. Okay, Briscoe and Green, now it's time for you guys to get to work. The police retraced Parkman's last day. One woman who owed Parkman money told how she ran away from him when he demanded the dollar he had seen in her hand as she tried to buy food. Another man recalled that Parkman had placed a grocery order for Thanksgiving to be sent to his home. Others remembered him wishing them a happy Thanksgiving. The police interview a man who said Parkman left some lettuce with him, saying he'd return for it soon so he could have lunch with his wife at 2 p.m., something he had done each and every day of their 33-year marriage. I can just hear Lenny Briscoe saying, that Parkman was a busy guy. Now, the police learned something else, that Dr. John Webster had visited the Parkman home earlier that day, suggesting they meet at the medical college that afternoon at 1:30. They also learned that at 1:45, someone saw Parkman enter the school. Now, Webster's on the cops' radar. They ask around and they find out that Webster was home by 6 p.m. and went to a party at a friend's house. He appeared calm, but suspicions were raised, and on November 27th, the police search Webster's room at the laboratory. They find nothing. This, ladies and gentlemen, is EPHRAIM Littlefield. He was a janitor at the medical college. He was under suspicion as he had access to Webster's lab. But Littlefield, he had suspicions of his own. 5 days after Parkman disappeared, Littlefield had watched Webster from under the laboratory door and saw him moving from the furnace to the fuel closet and back 8 times. Yeah, he counted. Later in the day, the furnace was burning so hard that the wall on the other side was hot to the touch. So on November 29th, Littlefield began chiseling away at the wall under Webster's private lab privy, where the police had not searched. The next day, he broke through, and there, on top of a mound of dirt, he saw a human pelvis, a dismembered thigh, and the lower part of a leg. Now, look, bones in a vault would be expected. It is, after all, where remains from human dissections were tossed. But the police were called, and the city coroner, Jabez Pratt, came in and identified these remains as Dr. Parkman's. Police then went to Webster's home and took him to jail on a charge of murder. When they told him what Littlefield had found, he was said to have exclaimed, "That villain, I am a ruined man." and later that night took strychnine. Now, I think it's strange that a doctor didn't know what the lethal dosage of strychnine was because the stuff only made him ill. Meanwhile, on December 1st, back at the lab, investigators traced a terrible smell to a tea chest, which they opened. Out tumbled an armless, headless, and partially burned male torso, whose head had been sawn off. Then they found the saw. They brought in Mrs. Parkman, and I'm, I'm sorry for laughing. I'm just imagining this moment. They bring Mrs. Parkman in, they show her the torso, and she identified it as her husband's. The coroner had already estimated the man's height to be 5'10", an exact match to George Parkman. And now the evidence against Webster seems overwhelming. But the Brahmins of Boston, bless their hearts, they were loath to believe that one of their own had done this awful deed. Longfellow's second wife, the former Frances Appleton, said, "Of course we cannot believe Dr. Webster guilty, bad as the evidence looks. Many suspect the janitor, who was known to be a bad man, and wish for the reward offered for Dr. Parkman's body." Nevertheless, on January 26, 1850, a grand jury returned a true bill that indicted Webster for the murder of George Parkman. Despite some Brahmin reluctance to believe his guilt, both Daniel Webster and Rufus Choate declined to serve as his counsel. It fell to Harvard graduate Edward Sawyer, who had handled Webster's financial matters but was inexperienced in criminal law, to become the accuser's lead counsel. And this would be a fatal decision by Webster. Some have called the Parkman murder the O.J. Simpson trial of the 19th century. One researcher summed it up by saying, quote, "It had everything a good murder story needs: a rich, well-known victim, a well-respected suspect, gruesome evidence, and a possible underdog hero." And like the O.J. Simpson trial, the public was consumed with every detail. Over 60,000 people would see at least part of the trial, as did reporters from as far away as London, Paris, and Berlin. On the first day of the trial, Webster pleaded not guilty, and it took only an hour to impanel a jury of 12 men. The trial began on March 19, 1850, with Chief Justice Lemuel Shaw of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court presiding. Leading the prosecution was the Attorney General, John Clifford. He would later serve as the state's governor. The trial proceeded. The jury visits the scene of the crime, even entering the privy pit. Back in the courtroom, the prosecution had the coroner explain what was needed to burn a corpse and the odor it would produce. Then they had an anatomy professor explain how his department's dissection specimens differed from the body found in the privy. The defense tried to create doubt that the body was Parkman's and questioned whether the wound on his body had killed him, as there was little blood near it. On the third day, Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., who was the dean of the Harvard Medical College, testified his belief that the body had been dismembered by somebody with a deep knowledge of dissection and anatomy, that a wound between the ribs would not necessarily cause a large amount of blood loss, and that the corpse's build was not dissimilar, his words, to that of George Parkman. Dr. Jeffries Wyman, he took the stand and showed how the bones found in the privy fit together. And this is Dr. Nathan Keep. He was George Parkman's dentist, and he was partnered, by the way, with a fellow named Dr. William Thomas Morton, the dentist who had a practice in Scully Square, where they first used ether in the practice of dentistry. But that's another talk for another night. Anyway, on the stand, Keep burst into tears as he showed how the loose teeth from the furnace fit into his plates. Composing himself, he showed through an inscription that the mold had been made specifically for Parkman. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the very first time that dental evidence was used in a trial. But it was Ephraim Littlefield whose testimony would be among the most damning. He told how Parkman had been after Webster to pay back his loan, how Webster had asked him if one could use a light inside the dissecting room vault, how Webster began locking his rooms, about how the normally cheap Webster uncharacteristically handed him a turkey just before Thanksgiving, just a few days after Parkman's disappearance. He told about the heat on the walls that led him to dig into the privy. The defense cross-examined and accused Littlefield of being after the reward, which of course he denied. The incompetent defense attorney also did not accuse Littlefield of being the murderer either, which would have been a nice way to deflect the charge. The prosecution wrapped up their case by presenting more witnesses who testified about Webster's unusual behavior after Parkman's disappearance. They also showed 3 unsigned letters that had obviously been meant to throw the police off the track of their investigation, and the handwriting was easily identified as Webster's. The defense took over, and Ed Sawyer went into action. He argued that the prosecution had failed to show beyond a reasonable doubt that Webster was the killer, or even how Parkman had died. He brought 23 character witnesses who claimed to have seen Parkman after his supposed disappearance. But the judge instructed the jury to ignore their testimony. He ruled that those sightings were actually those of a Springfield man who looked very much like Parkman, and without testimony from the man who looked like Parkman or anyone else, was in Boston on the day of Parkman's disappearance. As the trial ground to a close, Webster himself then took the stand against his attorney's strong advice, and in the 15-minute speech, he criticized his own attorney and presented his own version of the evidence, after which he called on the author of those anonymous letters to reveal himself. None did so because he himself was the author. The defense then gave a 6-hour speech on 4 key points that the prosecution had to prove. 1, that the body was Parkman's. 2, that a homicide had occurred. 3, that Webster had perpetrated it. And 4, that he had done so with malice aforethought. They contended that Parkman had been seen leaving the college on Friday afternoon and that the prosecution's case was in tatters. Most importantly, because there was no corpus delicti, no body that was conclusively Parkman's. And that, as a lawyer will tell you, was the main challenge faced by the prosecution. Because even though their circumstantial evidence was overwhelming, they still had the problem of the corpus delicti rule. There really was no body, at least one whole body. But Judge Shaw, in his instructions to the jury, made a precedent-setting ruling. He said that the jury only needed to find beyond the reasonable doubt that the corpus delicti was Parkman's. At the time, the standard in murder cases was proof to an absolute certainty that the dead body was that of the victim. But Shaw said in part, quote, "It sometimes happens, however, that it cannot be found, where the proof of death is clear. Sometimes, as in the case of a murder at sea, the body is thrown overboard on a stormy night. Because the body is not found, can anybody deny that the author of that crime is a murderer?" Judge Shaw also defined alibi, circumstantial evidence, and reasonable doubt. Now, interestingly enough, in 1850, many thought he was going way too overboard, far too argumentative for a judge. But those words, called the Webster charge, are still quoted in courtrooms today. And it took the jury less than 3 hours to convict Dr. Webster. And Judge Shaw passed the sentence, death by hanging. Now, Webster's lawyers fought to save their client's life. They submitted a petition for writ of error against Judge Shaw for his instructions to the jury. But since the hearing was held before Shaw and 4 of the judges, it should come as no surprise that the writ was denied. Webster appealed to the governor for a pardon. Unfortunately for him, the year before, a fellow named Washington Good, a sailor, had been hanged for the murder of a fellow sailor based on circumstantial evidence. And to pardon Webster after sending Good, who happened to be a black man, to the gallows would have undermined his reputation. It was only then that Webster confessed to the murder, claiming that he had lost control in an act of passion. Ironically, Such a confession would support a defense of temporary insanity, which, if used at the trial, might have saved George Webster's neck. Instead, he was hung by it on August 30th of 1850. Temporary insanity would play a huge role in the last of our three cases tonight. Now, it may have been over 50 years ago, but these three words can still strike fear into people who lived through the reign of terror that was the Boston Strangler. It happened actually as two waves of terror. The first began on June 14th, 1962, with the molestation and murder of 55-year-old Anna Slezer in her apartment here on Gainsborough Street in Boston. Just 2 weeks later, an 85-year-old woman was found dead of a heart attack, apparently after someone tried to strangle her. Then, 4 more sexual assault murders, all of women above the age of 65, quickly followed. And panic quickly grew as newspapers, radio, and television began to focus on the string of apparently connected murders. Without any sign of forced entry into their dwellings, almost all the women were assumed to have either known their assailant or have voluntarily allowed him into their homes, perhaps believing him to be an apartment maintenance person or some other service person. While the police were not convinced that all the murders were the work of one individual, much of the public believed so. The fifth murder occurred on August 30th, 1962. And then the murders stopped. September, October, November, nothing. And slowly, the tension and paranoia that had begun to grip the city abated. Then in December, 20-year-old Sophie Clark was found strangled and sexually assaulted. A few weeks later, the same fate befell a 23-year-old woman and panic returned. Then, 3 months later, March 1963, 69-year-old Mary Brown is found stabbed and beaten to death. In May, another woman, a 23-year-old, is also found stabbed to death. There's another brief respite over the summer before a 58-year-old is found strangled in September. 2.5 months later, another strangled murder, this time of a 23-year-old. One writer described it as if Jack the Ripper had returned not to London, but to Boston. The reward for information leading to the capture of the strangler rose with the ensuing panic until it reached over $100,000. Police were so desperate that in 1964, January, they brought in a Dutch psychic named Peter Herkos to help them find the strangler. They would have had better luck with Dionne Warwick and her friends. It seems that by 1964, everybody had an opinion that they wanted to share about the case. Psychiatrist James Bressel weighed in, saying that he believed the strangler was an unmarried, paranoid schizophrenic. He got his picture in the paper, but the police had no better leads. Others theorized he was a homosexual, not explaining why a homosexual would be raping women. Anyway, we come now to January 4th, 1964, and the last victim attributed to the strangler was the 11th, 19-year-old Mary Sullivan. Her body, like so many others, was left naked, a nylon stocking around her neck. The murderer also placed a New Year's card between 2 of her toes. And then once again, the murders stopped. Now, during the time the Boston Strangler was actively murdering women in the Boston area, police were investigating another crime spree that was underway that didn't get much media attention. All over southern New England, the Green Man, who got his nickname because he always wore dark green work pants, was apparently raping hundreds of women after slipping into their apartments, tying them up. On October 27th, a young woman was attacked in her home by a man who gained entrance by pretending to be a detective. He pinned her down on the bed and threatened her with a knife. "Not a sound, or I'll kill you," he told her. After tying her hand and foot and molesting her, he inexplicably made off, simply saying, "I'm sorry." When she freed herself, the woman called the police, who linked the Green Man to Albert DeSalvo, a convicted sex offender who had 4 years earlier served a year in jail for rape. They arrest the 33-year-old married man who had 2 children. Now, DeSalvo's childhood was horrible. His father was a violent, wife-beating alcoholic who used to bring prostitutes home and force his children to watch his sexual activities. Albert and his sisters were forced to steal to survive. Their father taught them shoplifting, robbery, as well as breaking and entering. At the age of 10, Albert started prostituting himself to the homosexuals in the area, and at 12, he was sent to a reformatory. He joined the Army in 1948, turned his life around a bit, won the U.S. Army middleweight boxing championship, married a German girl whom he brought back to the United States. But posted at Fort Dix, he was later charged with a sex offense that involved the molestation of a 9-year-old girl. But the charges were dropped when the parents refused to proceed with the case, and he was later honorably discharged. The police had DeSalvo sent to the hospital at Bridgewater State for observation, where he became something of a braggart to the other patients, apparently boasting about his sexual exploits. Then he allegedly confessed to his cellmate, a murder suspect named George Nasser, that he, Albert DeSalvo, was in fact the Boston Strangler. With a reward sitting out there for information leading to the Strangler's arrest, Nasser contacted his lawyer, whom he persuaded to meet DeSalvo. And you all probably know the lawyer's name, was F. Lee Bailey. Albert DeSalvo admitted to Bailey that he was the Strangler, confessing not only to the 11 murders police had attributed to him, but to 2 others as well. He provided many chilling details of the deaths. Bailey contacted police who had a problem. While DeSalvo's detailed descriptions of the case were almost flawless, they had no physical evidence to try him. They decided to have the Assistant Attorney General, a fellow named John Bottomley, interrogate DeSalvo. Bottomley reported that DeSalvo possessed details about the murders not available by reading the newspapers. And now a legal battle begins that would make F. Lee Bailey a legal star. Because if Bottomley determines that DeSalvo was telling the truth, that he was the Strangler, then Bailey would ask psychiatrists to rule on whether DeSalvo was insane. If they said he was insane, then DeSalvo would make a formal declaration of his guilt. But if they said he was sane, there would be no confession, at which point proceedings against DeSalvo would stop because there was no physical evidence against him. The psychiatrist ruled that DeSalvo was insane, but the prosecutors refused to accept that the confession could be made under the under the protection of his insanity. So, if convicted of even one Strangler murder, Albert DeSalvo would die. So Bailey comes up with a brilliant maneuver to keep his client from the electric chair. DeSalvo would not stand trial for the Strangler murders. Remember, there's no evidence other than his confession, but he would stand trial for the Green Man case, which meant that he could bring in psychiatrists to testify to Albert's insanity, thereby allowing him to be declared legally insane and therefore not guilty by reason of insanity for any crimes committed, in this case, the Strangler murders. In 1967, Albert DeSalvo went on trial for the Green Man case, pleading insanity. He is instead found guilty and sent back to Bridgewater Hospital, but just 5 weeks later, he and 2 other inmates escape from Bridgewater. The police launch a massive manhunt. While the other 2 men are quickly found, it took 2 more days for DeSalvo to give himself up, and he's taken back into police custody. The police, unbelievably, allow him to give a brief news conference. Why not? In which he says, quote, "I didn't bother anybody," unquote. And he says that he escaped to bring attention to the fact that he had a mental illness and yet was being treated as a sane criminal. DeSalvo was transferred to the maximum security prison in Walpole, where he remained until November 25th, 1973. That's when he was stabbed to death in his cell. Nobody confessed, nobody snitched, and the murderer of Albert DeSalvo got away. Now, Nancy Grace or Greta Van Susteren or any of these TV legal talk show people would have a field day with this case. Lord knows producers sure have, with a TV special and 3 movies about the case. The most well known, of course, is the 1968 film starring Tony Curtis and Henry Fonda, which did a pretty good job of what the courts never did, which is convict Albert DeSalvo of the Strangler murders. Some people, however, question whether DeSalvo was indeed the Boston Strangler. Susan Kelly, author of The Boston Stranglers, plural, believes DeSalvo fabricated the entire story. And while she concedes that his confession was accurate on many details, she says, quote, "The newspapers were an excellent source of information, and it's very interesting that the details that Albert got wrong in his confession were identical to the details the newspapers got all wrong." And Kelly thinks several different people perpetrated the murders. Robert Ressler is a criminologist, and he's a former profiler for the FBI. He's the guy who coined the term serial killer. Among the many cases Ressler worked on was the Jeffrey Dahmer case. Ressler also believes it's unlikely that one person is responsible for all those murders. Quote, "You're putting together so many different patterns here that it's inconceivable behaviorally that all these could fit one individual." In 2000, attorney Elaine Whitfield Sharp took up the case of the DeSalvo family and the family of Mary Sullivan, who had been identified as the Strangler's final victim. She helped organize the exhumations of both Sullivan and DeSalvo, which supposedly revealed that DNA evidence found on Sullivan did not match DeSalvo. James Starrs, professor of forensic science at GW University, told a news conference that DNA evidence could not associate DeSalvo with the murder. That DNA and other forensic evidence were used to make the case that DeSalvo was not her killer by Casey Sherman, who happens to be Mary Sullivan's nephew, in his book, A Rose for Mary. For example, DeSalvo confessed to raping Sullivan, yet the forensic investigation, performed in 1964, before obviously more precise methods of identification were developed, revealed no evidence of sexual activity. There are also suggestions from DeSalvo that he was covering up for another man, the real killer, whom some believe was George Nasser, DeSalvo's cellmate at Bridgewater, to whom DeSalvo supposedly confessed. So why would DeSalvo admit to the crimes? The DeSalvo and Sullivan families said back then that he had hoped to secure a book and a film deal. At this point, perhaps we should change the name of the show from Law and Order Boston to CSI Boston, because remarkably precise tools, not available even a few years ago to Ms. Sharp and her private effort, have been applied to the case by the state, allowing law enforcement to provide us with some certainty about at least one of the crimes attributed to Albert DeSalvo. In 2013, the remains of DeSalvo were unearthed again from his grave here in Peabody, and his DNA compared to that found at the scene of Mary Sullivan's murder by a reputable, nationally known lab, and they matched, which allowed Attorney General Martha Coakley to say publicly, quote, "This leaves no doubt that Albert DeSalvo was responsible for the brutal murder of Mary Sullivan, and most likely that he was responsible for the horrific murders of the other women he confessed to killing." Neither the Sherman family or Whitfield Sharp are contesting the results, although Sharp has issues with the method police used to collect DeSalvo's family DNA. They still do not disagree at the highest level with the results. 3 murders, 3 separate centuries, all 3 still in their own way, shrouded in controversy. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us tonight. I'm going to turn back on my video and ask our host to come back, and I think we're going to take some questions.
Very good. Thank you all. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. Now we'll make sure that David is able to get them. I do have a couple from our streaming services. What was your favorite case to research out of the 3 that you talked about tonight?
It's the case I knew the least about, which was the Parkman murder. I'd heard, everybody studies the colonial history and the Revolutionary War, and of course, we've all heard of the Strangler murders. I'd heard George Parkman's name, and the more I dove into it, the more fascinated I became, especially with the idea that all these Brahmins, they just refused to believe that one of their own could have done this horrific crime. And even after some of the evidence, I love Francis Appleton. Bad as the evidence looked, we still cannot believe it. It's probably the janitor. That was just great. That was precious.
And then somebody had asked, are there any other cases that you would like to cover or delve into more?
One of them actually is in 1972, there was a fire at the Vendome Hotel in Boston. It was being refurbished. It was going to be turned into condominiums. There was a fire. 9 firefighters were killed that day when a section of the hotel collapsed, taking these brave men with it. There's always been chatter, and I know some people, specifically someone who was a newsman at the time, who believed that it was arson. The fire department did its investigation. They concluded that the fire was of an accidental nature. It was some workmen who left some equipment running, but there's always been the suspicion that it was how is it my father-in-law from Charlestown puts it, a successful fire, and which again would make it murder. And it's been, golly, this next year will be 50 years since the Vendome tragedy. But it's one of those, things that there are these little hints, little accusations out there, and that would be a fascinating case to dive into.
And then what about the cases that you researched? Was there one thing that really took you by surprise or that you weren't expecting, a turn or a twist?
Yeah, the idea that Webster, first of all, no, they don't want to believe he's guilty. All these Brahmins, nobody wants to take the case, so he puts his accountant. It's you're on trial for murder, and you're putting your accountant as your lead defense attorney. And the idea that if they had pled insanity, he might have at least gotten life or found his way maybe to McLean's, which would have been the irony of ironies, the very place that had been started by the man he had killed. That's the part that just, history is just filled with, tragic ironies like that.
And I think questions, that's all I had. If there's anybody.
I don't see anything else in the chat window. Boy, I want to thank everybody for showing up tonight, whatever your platform. Oh, wait a minute. Thinking of the Gardner Museum art theft, another huge Boston crime. How would you compare the change of investigative methods? Well, given that we still don't know where those paintings are, but we certainly know who the murderers were, at least the Dr. George Parkman's murderer was. The Gardner Museum, since it wasn't a murder, it's such a different case. I have a friend who's got some very interesting theories about it. He's been studying the Gardner heist for years. It's a different type of case, so it's hard to say. I don't know if DNA was ever collected at the Gardner. That was 93. I just think it's such a different case. It's hard to say. But thank you, Vivian, for the question. Okay, I think that would do it. Unless anyone else has a question. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. I appreciate everyone's attendance. Oh, applause. Thank you. That's what I miss. doing it by Zoom, not hearing the applause. But thank you.
Yes, and thank you very much, David, for this fascinating presentation.
Thank you. I
on some
appreciate
of
it.
our most notorious cases. And thank you all for attending. Just a reminder that we are going to move back into in-person programming beginning this upcoming Sunday. And thank you all for joining us, and we will see you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.